I guess it's a little bit hashgacha pratis that we should be discussing this period in the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, which is the story of Yud Dalet Kislev, the 14th of Kislev, the Rebbe's wedding. And that will be quite a bit of tonight, and then the trip to Israel, God willing. But I think the wedding is extremely important, as we'll see. First of all, it's on this Monday. So, as I say, Bashgacha Pratis, we are discussing the anniversary of the Rebbe. And the Rebbe used to say, he said at least once, when he verbringed the first time on 14th of Kislev, I think it was his 25th wedding anniversary, he said, "This is the day that I became bound to you and you to me." In fact, I heard that after the Rebbetzin passed away in 1988, that means they were married for over 60 years, the Rebbe called in rabbis and asked them if he could still consider himself the previous Rebbe's son-in-law. So you see how much that whole aspect meant to him. So Lekovid Yudal Kislev, we're going to be discussing that shortly. Do you know that the Rebbe also would talk about the great miracle, as we mentioned last week, of the previous Rebbe being redeemed from Russia. He said that the wonders and miracles of the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, which were our very own eyes saw, and he'd say that none of the people working to free the previous Rebbe was harmed, not physically, not even financially. And this in a country that watched its citizens every footstep. And the Rebbe, as we mentioned last week, was freed from Russia, and they wanted to just leave him to go on his own, keeping back the family. He refused, and in fact, that the Rebbe's release, he insisted that the priceless library go with him. And we discussed also how Rabbi Mordechai Dubin was very, very involved with the Rebbe's release. Rabbi Mordechai Dubin was a member of the Latvian parliament and a chassid of the previous Rebbe. And as a result, the previous Rebbe would move to Riga in 1928. He would be there, at least his residence would be there till 1933, almost 6 years. But and then he would move to Warsaw, where he would be until the outbreak of the Second World War. He would witness the bombing of Warsaw. Now, throughout the time that he left Russia, he continued to worry about Russian Jewry. He would raise money for them, not only for their education and their studies, but he felt that one of the most important things for Russian Jewry was to get them home industries, because this way they'd be able to work without breaking Shabbos, etc. And he raised a lot of money in order to get these home industries started. He was also very, very involved with getting matzah for Russian Jewries, and he, in fact, got together Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, the Chavetz Chaim, Reb Chaim Ozer, and others to put out appeals to world Jewry to raise money, especially for matzah for Russia. And that year, he writes that he sent out 5,689 parcels of special flour in order to make matzah. He traveled to Berlin for that, and he met with many German rabbis, including Rabbi Meir Hildesheimer and others, in order to be able to help the Russian Jewry. They write that the wedding had to be delayed, and the reason why the wedding had to be delayed was simply because there was very little money, and he says the financial situation was precarious, and he was hoping it will all work out. The Rebbe writes, or says at a Farbrengen, that after the previous Rebbe left Russia, where the Soviet harassment was no longer on his head, and the truth is, he wasn't compelled to still have Mesiras Nefesh. Nevertheless, wherever the Frierdiker Rebbe went, in every country, in every city, he applied himself with true self-sacrifice, as we discussed. That's what his father, the Rebbe Rashab, always told him to do. And the Rebbe writes he never worked in an ordinary manner. And anyone who observed him could see this sacrifice in work, whether he was in Latvia, in Poland, and even in the United States, until his last breath. He would be working in that. And as I mentioned, the wedding had to be delayed for a couple of reasons, actually. One reason was there was no money at that time to make a wedding. And in addition to that, he wasn't sure whether the Rebbe's parents would get the necessary visa to come to the wedding. And that is very much which they wanted, that he should be able, that the Rebbe's parents should be able to come to the wedding. And then the Yud Beis Tammuz, the Rebbe, which was the first anniversary of the redemption. So on a few days before, the previous Rebbe's daughter, Rebbe Tzimchaim Mushka, who would be married to our Rebbe, accompanies her parents to the Bouldery Resort area, 15 miles from Riga, and they would rest there for several weeks during the summer. And the Rebbe actually sends a Russian language telegram to the previous Rebbe on the first anniversary. And the Farbrengens on Yud Beis Tammuz that first year were held in the most amazing way indeed. Then in Tishrei, that year they would have it in Riga. And the Rebbe actually would come to be with the previous Rebbe. So they talk about what happened the second day of Rosh Hashanah in the year 1928. The previous Rebbe had a house in Riga, and he himself would blow the shofar. the place was packed out. And then they discuss that there was a stream, a local canal right near the previous Rebbe in which he could do tashlich, but he decided to go to a very big river there, the Western Vina. It was a walk of about 1.5 kilometers, and they all followed to the tashlich, where afterwards the Rebbe said a mimer as well. Now, they asked the Rebbe once that did the previous Rebbe sit for Kiddush during the day or not? And his answer was he does not remember what the previous Rebbe did in Leningrad, but in Riga, he used to sit when saying the Kiddush. And then they begin preparing for the wedding. But just before that, on the 11th of Tishrei, the Rebbe writes a letter, the previous Rebbe writes a letter to his Hasidim as a personal request that they rejoice in Yom Sukkot and take renewed energy. And they saw the Rebbe would speak about that letter and say what an impact it has. And in 1977, he said the Chassidim here who were involved with that letter and how much it took the Chassidim. For that Simchas Torah, that was the last Simchas Torah that the Rebbe would be with his father, and he in fact went there. Now, Simchas Torah, the previous Rebbe would not allow people to rest, and the Rabbi Dubov says to who became close to the Rebbe at that time, and in 1948, the Rebbe writes to Rabbi Dubov that I remember you from Riga and the time that we spent there. The previous Rebbe, at that time, at the end of Tishrei, decided that the wedding between his middle daughter and our Rebbe would be in the month of Kislev. And Reb Chatzah Fagin, a secretary of the previous Rebbe, writes a very emotional letter to Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson. And he says, we need financial help so that our Rebbe can make a wedding in a proper time. And there's need for a dowry, and we have to work out how to raise the money. And with that request, it says that Chassidim in North America, including Montreal, Baltimore, Chicago, New York, London, Kharkov, they all get together to put together money for it. And the Rebbe, in fact, after the wedding, the previous Rebbe would send them a great thank you letter. At that time, the previous Rebbe's uncle and aunt, Reb Moshe and Rebbetzin Chaimushka Horenstein, she was a daughter of the Rebbe Marash. They were living in Otvotsk, and he said that I expect to have the Kabbalas Panim, the Badekin, and the Chuppah in Yeshiva Tomchet Mimim in Warsaw. There were many reasons why it would be in Warsaw and not in Riga. And he asks them to attend the wedding, and they should be the interferers. By then it was widely known that the Rebbe's parents would not be able to join him at the wedding. That's a whole different discussion of how they celebrated the wedding and all the letters that they wrote to the Rebbe and exactly what how to behave at that time. And he asks, the previous Rebbe asks his uncle and aunt to join him in Warsaw, and they would be as I say, the Unterführers. And a few weeks before the wedding, the previous Rebbe's daughter, Rebbetzin Chaim Mushke, Rebbe's Rebbetzin, would go to Warsaw to prepare for the wedding. On the 8th of Kislev, the Rebbe gets the permission and the visas to go to Warsaw to the wedding. And then they make the Tanoim, interestingly enough, on the 6th of Kislev. And the Rebbe writes, he speaking to Reb Shmuel Zalmanov, he says, at my Tanoim, there was actually barely a minyan. And again, the moving letters that the Rebbe's father writes to him at that time is something very emotional, and all the directives that he gives him of how to build a Chassidish home. The wedding would take place on the 14th of Kislev. So the Shabbos before was the 11th of Kislev, and that was the Ofruf of the Rebbe. Interestingly enough, that was yesterday. Today is the 12th of Kislev, but that Shabbos, it was the 11th of Kislev. And Rebbe Chaim Altois, who was very close to the previous Rebbe and to the family, he traveled with him to Kostroma. He describes the whole Ofruf and the day of the wedding with great descriptions. And much of the account that we have of our Rebbe's wedding is taken from the letters of Rabbi Chaim Altois. He says that the Rebbe was called up on Shabbos Parshas Vayetze in the house, and at about 1 o'clock after davening, the Rebbetzin Sterne Sarah, the mother of the Frierke Rebbe, prepared a lavish kiddush for about over 100 people. And between the meal, the previous Rebbe delivered a mimer called V'chol Bonaich Limudei Hashem, and it discusses the sanctity of the letters of the Torah and the spiritual effect that the Jew has at looking at them. And the Frierke Rebbe explained that is why a chassan is called up to the Torah on the Shabbos before the wedding. And he explained the whole concept of the Ofruf, and the mimer lasted for about an hour and a half. And then they began dancing with immense joy. The wedding, as I said, the Rebbe decided to have it in Warsaw. And there are many reasons for that. Warsaw would be the capital of almost Jewish people. They were, in 1939, there were close to 400,000 Jews living in Warsaw, which was a third of its population. And even though there was great anti-Semitism there, in 1915, 80% of the Jewish people in Warsaw were still a frum at that time. And many Hasidic leaders and Rebbes were living in Warsaw at that time. So on Sunday, the 12th of Kislev, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Rebbe and his family leave Riga for Warsaw. The reception of people who came to visit and to see the Rebbe was amazing. In fact, there was almost 500 feet of people coming to see the Rebbe off, to get into the wedding. And that was the departure. The Rebbe gave them a bracha, and from Riga, 10 Hasidim traveled with the Rebbe besides his family to go to the wedding with them. And Rebbe Altois writes that the Rebbe's youngest daughter, Sheindele, was served as hostess because her mother was in Warsaw preparing for the wedding. And the way she did the ofruf was something very special. The train came to Dvinsk, and Chassidim came out in large numbers to bench the Rebbe and to receive his blessing. And then they got to Vilna. And Rabbi Altois writes he was stunned to see such a large crowd standing at the station with beards, all frum people, wanting to see the previous Rebbe and to shout Mazel Tov. You will see that the word about the previous Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh in Russia and how he stood up to the communist regime hit the entire Jewish world. And wherever the Frierdiker Rebbe would go then, including in Israel, he would be received by so many people who wanted to see the Rebbe and get his blessing. And 150 years later, he writes, after Hasidus started, they could see the love that not only Hasidim, all Jews had for the previous Rebbe. It was a little sad, he writes, Reb Mordechai Dubin, who was so involved in getting the Frierdiker Rebbe out of Russia, wanted very, very much to get to the wedding, but they wouldn't allow it. In fact, they wrote that only after he was a member of parliament, and so he couldn't really leave to go. When the Reb Mordechai Dubin was a very big chassid of the previous Rebbe. In fact, he would travel with the previous Rebbe for 2 months. When the previous Rebbe went to America, and he tried to get Latvian citizenship for the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to, and when the previous Rebbe was trapped in Poland in 1939 at the time of the war. It was Dubin who interceded on his behalf and made sure that the previous Rebbe would be able to escape to Latvia and eventually to the United States. Unfortunately, in 1941, this Dubin was arrested by the Soviets due to his position, and he was released, but he was again arrested in 1948. The Frierke Rebbe tried so much, including returning to Rabbi Yitzchak Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel, to try and get him out. Unfortunately, they weren't successful, and he passed away in 1957 in Soviet Union. And now the Rabbi Altoy says that on Monday morning, the 13th of Kislev, the Rebbe's train came to Warsaw. And the crowd that was there was so much that they couldn't even leave the train. And the Chosin came to Rabbi Altois and said that the Rebbe asked us to go to my hotel. And so we locked our arms together and we pushed through, he says, that crowd. I didn't tell anyone that I am walking with the Chosin because I don't know if I would have gotten to the hotel. And then he says Rabbi Altois, let me tell you a moment about Warsaw taxi drivers. They are very great anti-Semites, but in one area, they are predictable and stable. Their love for money. So, not waiting for us to reach him, one of the taxi drivers saw us trying to push through. He drove his taxi to us. We were sitting in the car and we were saved. But, he says, we didn't know where our hotel would be. And so we drove around for an hour and a half until we found a hotel. And then the Rabbi Altoy says, being with the Rebbe for those 24 hours that he prepared for the wedding was something that remained with him for the rest of his life. The Rebbe, by the way, had been in Berlin after they went to Riga. He went to Berlin to join the Berlin University, which we'll discuss when we get to the Rebbe Mirza Hashem. But Rabbi Altoy says you should see that his fear of Hashem is totally his treasure. His davening, his saying Tillim, and they used to study Reishis Chochma, the Rebbe's, on the day they got married, the Krishma. It was totally a pleasure to see. He also says that he couldn't get over how much the Rebbe's knowledge was, including in Kabbalah, which he saw by the previous Rebbe's, by the Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, Rabbi Levik's letters to the Rebbe. The Frierke Rebbe sent personal invitations to all the Rebbes of Poland, the Imre Emes of Ger, the Sochachover Rebbe, the Akedis, the Alexander Rebbe, the Radzina Rebbe, Rebbe Mordechai Yosef Leiner, as well as to Twersky, and he says to them that he's inviting them personally to the wedding. And Reb Menachem Zemba, a very great Torah scholar who Nebuch was killed in Warsaw, Hashem Yimkem Dom, spent 3 hours with the Frierdiker Rebbe on that day. The night before the wedding, they call it the groom's table. There was a very great simcha, and once again, the previous Rebbe said a mimer as well at that time. Now, the wedding itself would take place in a most amazing way. In the afternoon, the chosen davened the mincha before his wedding, and to recite the long vidui of Yom Kippur, and he says, only I and him were in that room. I was so absorbed in the way he prepared himself for the wedding in saying the vidui, and I saw that we were in total different worlds, and the way the Rebbe would prepare himself, and the visions that he saw then, he saw that the Rebbe was on a total different level. After he finished davening, the Rebbe would turn to Rabbi Altois. He says his face was as white as chalk. His body was weakened from the fasting and the davening. And I suggested that he rest a little bit, but he didn't even speak one word of chol, because he was told by the Frierdiker Rebbe to study that day, and he was learning Reishis Chochmah. At about 6 o'clock that evening, the Rashag and the Rebbe's uncle came to bring the chosen to the yeshiva for the chuppah. And Rabbi Altois writes that it wasn't only the Rebbe that fasted, but the previous Rebbe, the Rebbetzin, and their daughters all fasted on that day. And in fact, the Frierdiker Rebbe fasted the days of all his daughters' chuppahs. The Kabbalah's Panim took place in the Yeshiva Tomchei Tmimim of Warsaw. It was all freshly painted and set out beautifully, and they had to make sure that no visitors smuggled their way in. So only those who had an invitation were allowed into yeshiva, but he also writes that if you bribed the policeman, you were allowed to enter, and there were many pickpockets at that time, many thieves in Warsaw, and they went as they wished. The Chassan arrived and came to the Kabbalah's Panim, and he writes that the Rebbe was sitting next to his father-in-law, but you could see he was very uncomfortable in sitting so close. And the previous Rebbe was wearing a shtreimel. Now that shtreimel or spodik, in general, it was only worn in Lubavitch. And there were only a couple of times, including in Israel. But once they left Lubavitch, they didn't wear a shtreimel anymore. But at the wedding, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, was wearing the shtreimel of his Zayda, the Rebbe Marash, and it was a very, very awesome sight. At about 6:30, the color came, and then the previous Rebbe began speaking. And this is something we should all know for every chuppah. And the previous Rebbe says, it is known that during a wedding, during the chuppah, the souls of the parents come from Olam Ha'emes, the world of truth. To every Jew's wedding, there is at least 3 generations that come to the chuppah, and for some, there are even many more generations. And so he said that in order to invite the souls of all our holy Rebbes and ancestors, that they should dress the chosin and kala, he's going to tell a mimer, he's going to say a mimer in which there will be a teaching from the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe Marash, and also from the groom's great-grandfather, the Rebbe Baruch Sholem, and from the Rebbe Rashab. And whenever someone quotes a saying in their name, you should imagine that they are standing with us. And he says there was total silence. The previous Rebbe's face changed from red to white. He looked like an angel. And he started to say the Maimer L'chod Doidi Likras Kala, the famous Maimer that we all say at a wedding. And in fact, in 1953, the Rebbe would talk about this invitation of the souls of the Rebbes coming to the chuppah, and he also gave an adaptation of that Maimon in 1954 of L'Chodedi, and that is what everybody says today. After the Kabbalah's Panim, the Frierke Rebbe and the Rebbe went into a room, and then they untied all the knots of the Rebbe's clothing. The Rebbe says, I believe they even untied my suspenders that held up his trousers. There was great flower arrangements. It was really beautiful. And on the way to the Badekin, the Rebbe, previous Rebbe, put on a kittel onto our Rebbe, and it was made from a shirt of the Rebbe Rashab, and he put the silk garment, gartel around him, and everybody blessed him, as well as the previous Rebbe's father-in-law, Rabbi Avram Schneerson, was also asked to bless them, and then they sang the Alter Rebbe's Niggun as they went to the Badekin. When they left the Badekin, the previous Rebbe, and as we mentioned, Rabbi Moshe Horenstein, were the ones who were the interferers to the chuppah. And thousands of people, it was a very cold winter, were waiting outside to see the chuppah as well. He says over 5,000 people came to see the chuppah, and it was very, very difficult to get the people involved to the chuppah. Actually, police had to come and to clear away the way to it. And after the chosin came to the chuppah, the previous Rebbe went back to the yeshiva holding 2 candles, and he joined his wife, Rebbe Tzinacha Medina, in escorting the kala to the chuppah. He was joined by his mother, and they all circled around the chosen. It was the Kala, the previous Rebbe, the Kala's mother, grandmother, and the Rebbe's aunt, Chaimushke, and the uncle, Reb Moshe Horenstein. The Frierke Rebbe himself obviously said the Birchas Edison, and he says, the Rebbe's clear, sweet voice called out. It was both mournful and elated at the same time. And everybody's hearts were just melting when the Rebbe told that bracha. The chosen betrothed the Kala with a golden ring. And the Frierke Rebbe said that even the markings, the metal stamp of how clear the gold was, should be removed. The witnesses of the chuppah were Dov Ber Shmotkin, Moshe Shmotkin, and Cooper Stock, and the Frierke Rebbe also said the Sheva Brachas. And the Rebbe told people to hold the chuppah outdoors. And he said, my wedding took place during the winter, and it was very cold, and my chuppah was still held under the stars, and thank God I am very happy with my marriage. There was the Yichud room, and the Rebbe writes that there were many ganovim at that wedding. In fact, the Rebbe's own ksubah was stolen. And he says the previous Rebbe sat down and wrote him a new ksubah, which he was happy about because he got another document of the Rebbe. The previous Rebbe only wanted the spiritual things to take place in the yeshiva. The wedding itself was in a large hall. And the Rebbe would say that his wedding was done in the American style, so that the chuppah was in one place and the wedding was in another. And the previous Rebbe walked around the wedding with a bottle, giving l'chaim to everybody. And in 1987, the Rebbe says that during that time, I didn't want to remain sitting while the Rebbe was standing up giving out l'chaim. So I stood up from my place to help the Rebbe with the bottle and the cups, but he turned to me and he said I should be sitting. And when I attempted to insist anyway, he says Jews are after all stubborn, he said explicitly I shouldn't stand up. And the Rebbe writes that he was on pins and needles until that happened. The Rebbe also danced personally with the chosen and his own father-in-law. And at 11 o'clock, he said another mimer. And then at 12 at midnight, they started the meal. There was a lot of dancing. And again, the Rebbe told a chosen that when he got married, there was a dance in which all the Polish Rebbes took place. It took a dance together. And the Frierke Rebbe told him, you sit down. When the Polish Rebbes finished dancing, the Frierke Rebbe took his son-in-law and danced with him, one hand on the shoulder. At 3:30 in the morning, the Polish Rebbes left, and the crowd stands with the Frierke Rebbe sitting in the middle, and they sing songs for another half hour. And he says another mimer. The meal of the wedding finished at 6 a.m. At that time. And then the Rebbe, he writes that the thieves there were very, very terrible. Do you know that some of them had knives and they would cut the pockets, he says, and steal their wallets before they even know. And the Rabbi Altos writes that if we have the next wedding in Warsaw, we should all be warned. The Rebbe also says about the Sheva Brachas that took place the next night, which was on Wednesday, the 15th of Kislev. And he talks about the night he spent with Rab Meir Shapiro, the famous Lubliner Rav, who set up that famous yeshiva Chachmei Lublin. And he gave him his book Or HaMeir, and it contained a whole exposition on Rashi. The Rebbe writes he was at the wedding, and he was at my first Sheva Brachas. My shver wanted me to talk with him in learning. I tried to avoid it, but I wasn't able to. And I looked at his sefer, and I was able to discuss it to that time. And he made a very, very big impression. Afterwards, the Freak Rebbe left. They left Warsaw, and they arrived back in Riga on that Friday morning. And the Sheva Brachas was something special. Yutas Kislev also took place during the Sheva Brachas. So that whole inspiration of that wedding, as I say, that was the time that the Rebbe became connected to us, and we with him, was something that left an indelible impression on all the people that were there. The Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, felt that he should go to America to raise money for Russian Jewry, as well as to check out what America was like and how he could strengthen Judaism there. But on the way to America, he says that when he was in Russia, he used to often go to the Ohel, to the grave sites of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe Marash, as well as the Rebbe Rashab. Obviously, those were in the days that he was able to. Afterwards, and I don't know if other people do, but I don't really appreciate exactly what it means to be at the Ohel. We could just see from how often the Rebbe went there and how much he spoke about it, and every bracha he gave was Asgalatzian, how much a visit to the Ohel meant. And the Frierk Rebbe writes that as he cannot go to the Mekemes HaKadoshim to daven, and he'd like to very much, so basically, before going to America, he decided to take a visit to Israel. It was very hidden at that time. He would be in Israel for a total of 2 weeks, but it was hidden at first because they had to get the necessary paperwork. Only once they got it was it publicized that he was coming. He would leave Riga on the 22nd of Tammuz on a Tuesday in that year to go to towards Russia. That would be a year later in 1929. To go to Israel. And he would arrive in Israel on the 2nd of Av. He would be there till the 16th of Av, a period of 2 weeks. They say the Rebbe was very short of money. He had a wonderful chassid by the name of Rebbe Avram Paris, who lived then in Israel. And he knew the Rebbe's financial situation. He had a paradise. He had a whole orchard there. And to help his Rebbe, he just sold the orchard, got a big bundle of money, and then he got help from other people. He raised a fortune of money. And when the Rebbe came, he took that bag of money and put it into the Rebbe's hand. And the Rebbe said, "What is this?" He said, "This is Maimed." And it was actually that money that helped the Frierke Rebbe really have an amazing trip into Russia. So, as I say, into Russia, into Israel. Now, in 1929, it was not easy to come to Israel, and they would have to go through trains, boats, and all kinds of places until they would get there. So on the 22nd of Tammuz, approximately 80 Hasidim, including Rab Mordechai Dubin and the famous Rabbi Yaakov Landau, who would become the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak, they got on the train to escort him on his trip. Together with them went his Rebbetzin as well as his daughter Shena. And they got to the train station at the Latvian border, and then the Rebbe and his son-in-law, the Rashag, went to Berlin. When they came to Berlin, there they would meet our Rebbe. And that was on Wednesday, actually. At the train station, the Rebbe came to meet him. The previous Rebbe spent that day in a hotel, and the Rebbe was with him that whole day. There was a chassid by the name of Rebbe Zelig Slonim, Israel Zelig Slonim. He actually came at that time also to South Africa for the previous Rebbe. And he was told that the Rebbe would be in Berlin and he was going to Israel. Although Rabbi Slonim lived in Israel, he was traveling at that time on behalf of the Frierke Rebbe, so he knew he wouldn't see him. And he was in Warsaw. So he took a train from Warsaw to Berlin to be able to see the previous Rebbe. And when he came into the Rebbe said, "I see for you a trip is nothing. You come from Warsaw to Berlin, Berlin back to Warsaw." And they discussed all their personal, the aspect of their trip. And that Shabbos, the Rebbe and his two son-in-laws were together. They had traveled on a boat which went on the Adriatic Sea. On Sunday, it came to the shore, and at that harbor, the Rebbe and the Frierke Rebbe took leave of each other. and the Rebbe went back to Berlin. Later, when he's in Israel, someone would ask him, why didn't the Rebbe follow you to Israel? And he said, go with you to Israel. And he said that the Rebbe is of the opinion that once you go to Israel, you may not leave it, even if you go for a short time. And that's why he didn't come with. And then the Rebbe got onto a boat that would take them to Alexandria. And on Monday of the 28th of Tammuz, they would come to Alexandria. So the Rebbe traveled from Riga to Berlin to Prague to Vienna to Trieste to Brinswy and then to Alexandria and finally to Jerusalem. He came on Tuesday to Alexandria, and that had quite a big Jewish population at that time. And Wednesday, they davened in the old Jewish quarter in Alexandria, and there was an important Jewish diplomat who met him, and he thanked him very much for getting him all the paperwork that he would need to get into to Israel. There was a Kabbalah's Panim, the welcoming that the previous Rebbe got when he would come to Israel is something that is very difficult to understand, because at that time, every person who believed in Torah and mitzvahs were all so impressed. And you see the great announcements all over Israel in welcoming the previous Rebbe to Israel. And as I said, the previous Rebbe wrote that the reason he is coming to Israel is to be able to daven at those holy places. On Thursday, the 2nd of Av, 5:30 in the morning, he comes to the train station in Rehovot. Even though it was very early in the morning, people were there to welcome him, and wherever he went in Eretz Yisrael, he was crowded with people welcoming him there. And I'd like to finish off here with one story that happened, unfortunately, when the Rebbe left Israel. There was a Lubavitcher Chassid who had a problem. He had an acrimonious marriage, and the marriage was dissolving. And he went to the Beis Din, and the Beis Din told him that he has to give a get to his wife. And he refused to give the get. So the members of the Beis Din came to the Frierdiker Rebbe and said to him that maybe you can help getting him to give a divorce. So he said, well, he's a Lubavitcher Chassid, so when he comes to see me, I'll speak to him. But the man knew that it's not going to, that he could get into basically the previous Rebbe will come after him. So he didn't visit the Frierdiker Rebbe. But in the last train station, before the Frierdiker Rebbe left, the man figured that there's so many hundreds of people, he won't notice me. So he came to say, basically, to say goodbye to the Rebbe. The previous Rebbe did notice him. And he called him over. And he said, if the Beis Din tells you to give a get, you have to listen. And the Chassid, for whatever reason, had such an acrimonious relationship, he still didn't want to. So the previous Rebbe told him that it says in the Gemara, there are two ways that a married woman gets her release from her husband, either with a get or with the passing of the husband. You take your choice. And he still didn't listen. And sadly, the Freak Rebbe left, and within that year, the man passed away. I think it was from a bullet. That is one thing you don't play with. The trip that the previous Rebbe took to Eretz Yisrael, I'm finishing tonight just with that beginning of the trip and the many people that he would meet, including Rabbi Sonnenfeld, including many meetings with Rabbi Cook, and the whole story, how he went to Tzfas, to Hebron, and that was sadly just a few weeks before the massacre that would take place in 1929. We'll continue with his visit to the Kotel and with the other visits that he had. I hope tonight was inspiring to all of you, especially about the wedding which takes place on Yud Dalet Kislev. May we celebrate the anniversary, and may we be privileged to celebrate the coming of Mashiach with our Rebbes, actually with us in person. Shkoyach, a good foch. Thank you for listening.
Rabbi Karlebach, thank you again. Tomorrow, anybody who's interested to have an oil experience, to visit the Rebbe's, to have a virtual visit to the Rebbe's resting place, please WhatsApp me. For those who have my number, if not, you can find it on Facebook. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Rabbi Karlebach, thank you again.